Welcome to the Road from Emmaus podcast. I'm your co-host, Ron Morgan, along with fellow co-host Skip Culver. Our goal for each episode each week is to take you on a guided tour of redemptive history, showcasing the beauty, splendor, and unity of God's amazing story of cosmic redemption, restoration, and renewal. We hope that our warm conversational tone and format make an unfamiliar topic for many and intimidating for some more approachable, accessible, and digestible, growing and edifying the body in the process. This is our 24th episode in our journey through the Scripture series. For those new to the podcast, our discussion format each week will be to respond to the discussion questions embedded at the bottom of the study notes document. You can find this linked in the podcast description box. In the same box, you'll also find a link to our website, roadfromemmaus.com. That's roadfromemmaus.com, where we share a bit about ourselves, the genesis for our podcast name, and provide several helpful resources to help you dig further into redemptive history, no matter where you are in your journey. From time to time, Kit and I will also respond to direct questioners, listeners such as yourself pose that fit our current topic. You can reach us at contact@roadfromemmaus.com. Before we jump in, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube podcast so that you receive notifications for fresh content, making sure you hit that bell in the process. We drop a new episode every Monday, so we look forward to you joining us as we take this exciting ride through the journey through scriptures with us. Just a quick recap for where we are. As we've mentioned in past episodes too, it was by God's design and also our design to really sit at Sinai for a little bit. However, now that we're starting to re-embark on our journey too and to move forward, it's important too that we remember a few key headlines. Kids can unpack those in just a little bit too. But one of the things that we want to be a key through line is that progress geographically does not also always equate to progress in the heart. And so as we really engage and keep in mind that Israel as a people, as a nation, in terms of what they represent redemptive historically, we need to keep in mind that geographical progress does not always equate to matters of the heart. And we want to be mindful of that and frame our context as we engage today. So with that in mind, too, our first question is, in what way did God's self-revelation set the stage for his renewal of the covenant? And then why is departure in this context deceptive in terms of assumed growth and change, which I've already spoken to? And just for our listeners, we're going to be covering quite a bit of ground today too. And so our focus is actually to go from Exodus 34 and 40 through Leviticus, Numbers, and then wrapping up with Deuteronomy. So Kits, I will hand it off to you.
Well, I think as you said, it's important as we begin to depart from Sinai, where God had made the Sinai covenant, the law of Moses, as we call it, with Israel, to keep all of that circumstance in mind and what it really represented. We saw that what God was doing at Sinai as he brought the people of Israel out of Egypt was ratifying in a formal way, an explicit way, that Abrahamic relationship with Abraham's descendants. They were the people who were set apart by God to uniquely be his covenant son for the sake of ministering his blessing to all the families of the earth. And that Abrahamic obligation, that Abrahamic election is what is the lens through which we need to be constantly assessing Israel, its relationship with God, how well it's doing under this covenant. And we saw that just as Israel, as the Abrahamic people, had been unfaithful to their God, even while they were in Egypt, as soon as he brings them out, right away they begin to show the fact that they don't trust him. They don't yield themselves in faithful, confident, submissive trust to him. And even as he brings them to Sinai and he makes the covenant with them, we saw how very quickly, under this condition of covenant blamelessness, God enjoys this fellowship meal with them. But immediately they're making the golden calf as a way to try to secure their well-being and their closeness with God, their ability to continue on to Canaan. And this just becomes a repeated pattern over and over again. And so this self-revelation idea here, in terms of renewing the covenant, you had Moses pleading with God to not forsake his people when this golden calf episode happened. And God relented and he said, yes, I will continue to lead them. But as part of that process of Moses' intercession, he pled with God to show him his glory. And God showed him his glory by proclaiming his goodness, specifically this idea of his loving kindness or his covenant love. It refers to his covenant integrity, his faithfulness. He would lead the people, but not because of them or because of how well they were doing or how faithful they were, but because of his own commitment to his purposes. And those purposes were again bound up in Abraham for the sake of the world, ultimately for the sake of the creation. So God, on the one hand, is dealing with Israel according to his purposes in and through Israel for the world. Israel, for its part under the covenant, continues to be unfaithful to its sonship, to its calling, to its responsibility. And that's going to mark them throughout the whole rest of their history, all the way up to the point where Jesus comes into the world. So as we move now from Sinai and departing from Mount Sinai towards Canaan, and then by the end of Deuteronomy, Israel is on the plains of Moab, just on the eastern side of the Jordan River and preparing to enter into the land. That whole process takes about 40 years, but it's a process of, again, demonstrating those two counterbalancing truths, that God remains faithful to the people because of his faithfulness to his purposes in and through them, the people of Israel being unfaithful to him and really being in a constant position of jeopardizing and bringing in, into kind of forfeiture the covenant relationship that he's established with them.
It is funny you mentioned this too. Maybe you can speak on this a little bit. Why are so many people, um, I wouldn't say ignorant, but maybe misconstrue the progress that they see in Israel physically as being attributed to like their own virtue, right? Like why is that such a common perception of this time? Like clearly the Lord is blessing them or moving them forward because he sees something good in them. How are people arriving at that? And then maybe what would you say to kind of push back on that perception or like that conclusion that people are reaching?
Well, I think most fundamentally, it goes back to the way that we tend to think as human beings in our natural state. And I know we've talked about this in the past, this idea of human spirituality, human religion as magic, this idea that we try to discern the powers and the forces or the deities, whatever gods may be out there. We try to figure out who they are, and then we figure out ways to reach out to them, to get their attention, to encounter them, and to ultimately solicit their favor towards us. And that's what all human religion is about, is figuring out how to access and appropriate benefit from the deities, the powers, the forces, whatever happen to be out there. And that in itself reflects this human dynamic of relationships in the way that we naturally view them, which is this kind of reciprocity, tit for tat. You scratch my back, I'll scratch your back. And so in terms of religion, we, as it were, want to figure out how to scratch the deity's back so that he'll scratch our back. And so we naturally think in terms of divine favor towards us as being the result of us behaving the way we're supposed to behave. If it goes well for us, it's because we've done the right thing. We've been virtuous, we've been obedient, whatever it happens to be. If it doesn't go well for us, then we've done something wrong. Either we're unfaithful, or in some instances, people conclude, oh, God is unfaithful. God isn't just. God isn't good. And you see this even with Israel's life. At the time when Jesus was in the world as an Israelite, it was very common in Israel's thinking, even after 2,000 years of this Abrahamic relationship, for them to, as it's recorded in the Gospels, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? If if you have a bad circumstance or outcome, somebody has failed. Because if you're doing what's right, it's going to go well for you. And so we tend to look at Israel's blessedness in a sense, or its favor with God, or the good things that happen to them, and want to ascribe that to somehow they've been faithful, they've been doing what God wants them to do. And on the other side, when we see things not going well for them, we say, how could they be so stupid? Why wouldn't they do what God required of them? If I were there, I wouldn't have done this.
Right.
Right. I wouldn't have sinned like the fathers did. They're the ones who can't get this figured out. But it's still all grounded in this idea of God blesses those who do what's right, and he punishes or, brings bad things to those who don't do what he wants them to do.
Indeed, indeed. Uh, Switching gears a little bit and moving out of Exodus, how do the books of the Leviticus and Numbers speak to the equally important relational and logistical aspects, respectively, that served as critical resource for Israel's journey to the Promised Land, Kit?
Well, remember that when Moses went back up onto the mountain after the golden calf episode, uh, that's where God completed his giving of the provision to the people of Israel through Moses for the sanctuary, for its furnishings, for the priesthood. And then when Moses comes down, they spend the next many months gathering the materials, building the tabernacle, all of the structural aspects of it, the furnishings, the altar, the lampstand, the brazen altar, the Ark of the Covenant, getting the whole thing fitted out with this idea again that God's going to dwell in the midst of them. This is to be his dwelling place. So all of that happens at Sinai. And what's happening in Leviticus is you have God essentially fleshing out for them this sacrificial system, which has to do with maintaining or restoring the people's cleanliness. It's a purification system to keep Israel clean and pure so that the Father and the Son can dwell together. And even issues of Yom Kippur, that kind of high holy day, the Day of Atonement, was not about God punishing sin as much as it was about him giving to them a provision of cleanliness, a provision of life out of death, so that the people and the whole structure of the covenant, even the sanctuary itself, could be purified and maintained in its cleanliness so that God can continue to dwell with them. It was God's goodness towards them. And so Leviticus, with all of its vast prescriptions, a lot of people don't even like to read Leviticus because it's just this offering and this sacrifice and this ritual for purification and touching a dead body and diseases and all of these different things, mold in a house, and they say, okay, it's all kind of boring. But what God is doing is essentially establishing this reality that my dwelling place, sacred space, where I dwell with my people, is to be defined by cleanness, by purity, and therefore this is his provision to hold together that intimacy and his own presence with his people, in the context of constant impurity and defilement that comes from their disobedience. So that's Leviticus. And then in Numbers, you have the beginning of Numbers before the people actually depart from Sinai, where he's providing that logistical kind of physical provision for them, in terms of how the tribes are to form up as they now depart and move into the wilderness. They have to take this dwelling place of God with them. How are they to set up camp? How are the tribes to camp? And God has them with 3 tribes on each side of his tabernacle, once again emphasizing he's dwelling in the midst of his people.
Right.
So all of that is laid out and defined. And when they march out, who goes first and what's the procession of the tribes and where is his ark and how does that work? And then even the sons of Levi, the Levites, the priests were taken from the Levites, but also God said those who manage the logistical issues with my tabernacle will come from the Levites too. So Levi has three sons, Kohath, Merari, and Gershon, and they're responsible for the handling of the sacred things, the handling of the curtains and the draperies and the kind of the soft materials of the tabernacle. And then you have Merari that handles his family handles all of the hardware and the lumber and that sort of thing. And so everything is laid out by God as to how you'll move, how you'll pack up, who will go first, how you camp, how you sit. And all of those things are put in place before they finally set out after a year at Sinai,
Mhm.
Mount Sinai. They were there a year. They finally then set out for the land of Canaan, and that departure takes place in Numbers 11,
So
or
much
Numbers
context.
10, rather, I think.
Yeah, so much additional context. Uh, in what way did the dispatching of the 12 spies to scout out Canaan further illuminate the Lord's faithfulness to his people while simultaneously reaffirming their doubt and lack of faith in Yahweh to fulfill his promises? So once again, we continue to come back to that thread, and that
Right.
common motif that we see really defines Israel's heart relationship with the Lord, regardless what's happening with them geographically. Kid, speak to that.
Right. Well, that spy episode is kind of a climactic episode of unfaithfulness, a testing that brings a bad outcome, but it follows after two previous things, which are kind of a heightening, reaching towards that climax. So no sooner do they depart Canaan than the people are grumbling. They're grumbling to the Lord, and you have this situation of Taberah fire that breaks out on the outskirts of the camp as kind of a warning to the people about complaining against God. And then we go from there to a more narrow, intense kind of episode where you have Miriam and Aaron, who are Moses' sister and brother, who are complaining about the primacy of Moses. We are all God's people, or why does God speak to you? What about us? And so through that circumstance, then Miriam is struck as leprous, and Moses has to intercede and have God relent, but she's put outside of the camp for a period of purification. Well, so you have these two acts of rebellion that then are preceded by the spy episode. And what God does is he says, take a representative from each of the 12 tribes, 12 spies, and send them into the land of Canaan. And it has really two purposes. It's number one, to show them the Edenic quality of this land, that the place that God is giving them is a rich land, it's an abundant land. And even when the spies come back, they have a cluster, a branch with a cluster of grapes that they're carrying on a pole, two men with the pole on their shoulders, just as a kind of an exclamation point on the profusion and abundance of the land. But also, they are tested in that these spies see the fortified cities and the mighty men, the Anakim, even the back to the Nephilim idea of Genesis 6, these mighty, tall warrior peoples that inhabit the land of Canaan. So the spies come back and say, the Lord is right. It's a great city, or a great land, and abundant and profuse. And it is like the Garden of Eden. Oh, but there are giants in the land, and there are these mighty cities and military peoples that inhabit that land. And the people immediately go into this panic and, oh, woe is us, and we can't go up and take the land, and what are we going to do? And our children are going to die, and our wives are going to die, and oh, let's raise up some new leaders and go back to Egypt. It will be better for us in Egypt. And there are only two of the spies that dissent from that message, and that's Joshua and Caleb. So what comes out of this is the turning point in Israel's history. Up to this point, they were on the march toward Canaan.
Right.
Now, God, first of all, he takes the lives of all of the unfaithful 10 spies who brought back the bad report and caused the people to be fearful. But he also says all of this generation from 20 years of age and up are not going to inherit this land. The children that you are claiming to be afraid for are the ones who are going to go in and take the land. And so now it becomes this 40 years of wandering as the process by which God is going to take out all of this unfaithful population from among the people of Israel. That whole generation is going to die in the wilderness, and only Joshua and Caleb will go into the land. And ultimately, as we'll see, even Moses isn't allowed to enter the land.
Yeah.
So this is the turning point then where God says, okay, now this path straight into Canaan that wouldn't have taken very long is going to involve just this 40 years of wandering around in the howling wilderness until this whole generation is dead. And that's why it is kind of a high point, an exclamation point on this thing of, once again, God will continue forward. He will bring the people into Canaan, but the vast majority of the nation is going to die because of their unfaithfulness. God has had it at this point. And the writer of Hebrews speaks of this in chapters 3 and 4, this failure to enter the Lord's rest.
Yeah. And Kid, we've talked about it that Israel is truly not Israel too, or even this is a microcosm of that winnowing. And it ultimately comes down to where is your devotion and your dependence too. And we even see with Joshua and Caleb too, is that it actually ended up being a heart matter, right? And so
Right.
as much as we want to talk about corporate Israel too, at the end of the day, those who showed themselves to be faithful in terms of their belief and stuff too, were advancing in those promises.
Right. And just to let one quick
Yeah,
comment
go
to
ahead,
that
Kid.
effect. Joshua and Caleb, they didn't come back with a good report in the sense of saying, oh, no, no, there aren't any giants. In other words, they saw exactly the same things and made exactly the same assessment of the circumstances and the people and the threat, the
Yep.
power of this land and the nations that inhabited it. But what they said is, the Lord has given us this land.
Yeah, we trust in the
He
Lord's
has
promise. Yes.
told us that
Yep.
this will be ours. And so these people will become our prey. And so the difference wasn't in their perception of the lay of the land. Their difference was in their trust in God. And they said, it doesn't matter how militarized, it doesn't matter how strong, it doesn't matter how daunting this is, or even how physically impossible it seems. The Lord has covenanted this to us, and therefore it'll be fine. So it was really an issue of trusting God versus trusting circumstances and their own
Absolutely too.
resources.
Yeah, and we've said it before too, is that we trust in the God that promises, not in the promises of God, or in our
Right.
perception of those promises
Exactly.
as they relate to our own self-referential circumstances or what we would deem to be successful. On a similar note, and maybe you can unpack this a little bit, Kit. How did the Balaam episode in Numbers 23 through 24 provide what is arguably the most poignant testimony to Yahweh's commitment to his covenant despite Israel's failure? So once again, we come right back to that juxtaposition of God's faithfulness versus what he is experiencing from the very people that he has been utterly faithful to.
Right. Well, this is another one of those high points. This one comes at the end of the 40 years. The people of Israel are now camped on the plains of Moab. Moab is on the east side of the Jordan River. The whole of the book of Deuteronomy sits there on the plains of Moab, and it's essentially just Moses' last instruction to the people that concludes with his own death and the people's kind of final preparation to go into the land. But the Balaam episode takes place at the end of the 40 years, and they are there now on the plains of Moab, ready to essentially enter the land. And the king of Moab, Balak, has seen this people, and even for all their hardship and all they've gone through, they are there, and he's afraid of them. And typical of the way it worked in the ancient world, kings or rulers would call in priests or prophets or seers or people who they thought had spiritual power to, in a sense, pronounce condemnation or bring down a kind of curse on an enemy before going into a battle or before a confrontation. So that's what Balak does. He calls this prophet Balaam. We don't know how he knew him. It says he was a son of his people. He was Mesopotamian, and somehow he wasn't an Israelite. Balaam wasn't an Israelite, but he calls this prophet Balaam to come and to curse the people of Israel on his behalf. And there's three steps in this process. And so when these representatives of Balak come to Balaam and say, hey, the king of Moab wants you to come and curse these people, these Israelites, but he says, well, let me inquire of their God and see what he has to say. Well, initially God says, no, you can't go. I've blessed this people. You cannot curse them. And this harkens back again to the Abrahamic promise. We're back in that same thing again. I'll bless those who bless you, curse those who curse you. So Balak is seeking this prophet, this seer, this man who has power with the gods to come and to curse this people. Well, Balaam tells these representatives, Israel's God won't allow me to come with you. I can't come. So Balak a second time petitions him, and he says, well, let me go and ask him again. And this time God says, go, but only tell him what I want you to say. So there's a lot more in the story, but essentially, then you have these blessings. He comes and he says, I will speak on behalf of the God of Israel, and whatever he has to say, that's what I'll say. I can't curse them if he's not going to curse them. So what comes out of that are these two prophetic blessings that a Mesopotamian pagan prophet brings to a pagan king, the king of Moab, by which, as much as he seeks, even through payment, through different kinds of coercion to get Balaam to curse the people, Balaam ends up pronouncing these two very profound poetic blessings upon the people of Israel. And those blessings not only say, yes, they will inherit the land, but even how they will become a unique nation, a powerful nation. It's Abrahamic language. They will become a triumphal people, and even out of the midst of them will come this star, a scepter that will come to one within Jacob, taking us back again to Jacob's blessing of his sons, back the blessing on Judah, the scepter not departing from Judah. So these are prayers of blessing that God gives to Balaam that bring in all of Israel's covenant history and significance and God's promises to them, that even gives a kind of lens for interpreting what it will mean for them to inherit this land and the implications of it for all the families of the earth. So that's why the Balaam prophecies or prayers are so important in, again, keeping Israel's life and circumstance in its true context.
As the last book of the Pentateuch, Deuteronomy serves as its capstone. Moses, Israel's leader and mediator, reminds the people of their history with their covenant God, with the view to rightly perceiving and ordering their future with him in the covenant land. What purpose does this strategic admonition serve in revealing Israel's covenant significance beyond possession of this physical land, especially in light of Moses' own exclusion from entering Canaan?
Right. Well, I guess where my mind goes in this regard as focal points is this idea of the Song of Moses. And in the ancient world, and we still do it to this day, particularly often instructing children, we teach them songs to learn, whatever the alphabet, or that's the way that I was taught the books of the Bible, the New Testament as a kid, was with a song. And so Israel, the Song of Moses idea is introduced in Exodus 15 when God brings the sons of Israel out of Egypt, and then he brings them through this triumphal, miraculous deliverance through the Red Sea. And they sing the Song of Moses, which is a song of triumph, a song of redemption, a song of deliverance. And they say that Yahweh, our faithful covenant God, has brought us out to bring us to his holy mountain, that we would dwell with him in his sanctuary land. The Lord reigns forever. This is God's kingship, ultimately looking again to the whole earth. Well, that's a triumphal song of Moses, Deuteronomy ends with a second song of Moses. This one's very different. Moses, as kind of the climax of his rehearsing with the people of Israel, the title Deuteronomy isn't the Hebrew name of the book, but it's a Greek idea that has the idea of the second law, or a second rehearsing of the law. And this is Moses again rehearsing Israel's history, their covenant status, what God's done, how he's brought them, what this means, what lies ahead of them. And at the pinnacle of this is his challenge to them, as you said, to be faithful, to go forward, to follow the Lord fully. And they say, yes, we will do that. And he says, well, no, you really won't. As soon as you get in the land and it gets comfortable for you, and now you're dwelling in cities you didn't have to build, and you're, reaping crops from fields you didn't have to till and clear, and drinking from wells you didn't have to dig. It'll get easy for you and comfortable, and you'll forget the Lord, and you'll begin to wander, and you'll stray after other gods. And so really what lies in your future ultimately is exile, desolation, and captivity. Moses tells them what's eventually coming to them, but that gets canonized, if you will, in a song, the Song of Moses. God tells him, write the words of this song and teach it to the sons of Israel. So it's a song that they are now to sing throughout their generations, and the lyrics of the song concern their unfaithfulness and the future unfaithfulness of their descendants, and how the outcome of all of this is going to be calamity, judgment, exile, captivity. So that's kind of the way the book of Deuteronomy ends. Once again, God will uphold his covenant, but the people will not be able to keep it. And as you said, even Moses himself, we don't need to rehearse exactly what happened, but Moses himself showed himself unfaithful in a way that God said, I will not let you enter the land. He goes up onto the mountain and he's able to see the whole land, but God doesn't let him enter the land. And his mantle in leading the people and being the mediator on their behalf is passed off to Joshua, who is one of the two faithful spies. So anyway, there's kind of a kind of high note at the end of Deuteronomy, the Pentateuch. This is the end of the Pentateuch, the books of Moses, where the people of Israel are now poised to go into the land, but it also has a note of warning and kind of a downside to it, that this isn't going to go well for you. This isn't going to turn out to be what you think it's going to be. And your hope of all of this blessedness and profusion and abundance, it's all going to ultimately be taken from you.
Yes, cautionary tale too, but also promise, knowing too that, as we've said before, God is faithful indeed.
Yep.
And rest in that. We sincerely hope this time you share with us has been profitable. Once again, don't forget to check out our website and subscribe to our YouTube podcast and hit that bell for notifications, so you always know when we're going to drop the next episode. For Kid, I'm Farhan, and we'll see you down the road.